I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe because I need to get it out. Maybe because, for the first time in my life, I'm finally standing up for myself. My family has spent years pretending I don't exist unless they need something from me. But this time, they took it too far. I grew up knowing I was the extra child, the one they had because that's just what people did. My parents already had a golden child, my younger sister, Mia. She wasn't just their favorite, she was their everything. I still remember Mia's 3rd birthday. They rented out an entire party venue, had a petting zoo, a magician, and a cake that looked like it had been handcrafted by angels. I was 6 at the time and thought, wow, I can't wait for my birthday. It came 3 months later. I got a store-bought cupcake and a used Barbie with a missing shoe. It was like that every year. Mia's birthdays were legendary. Bounce houses, trips to Disneyland, princess-themed extravaganzas. Mine? A quiet dinner at home, sometimes not even that if my parents were too busy. When we got older, it got worse. My parents made it their mission to be at every single one of Mia's school events. Dance recitals? Front row. Cheerleading competitions? They'd bring banners. When she got 3rd place in a local spelling bee, my mom threw a dinner party. Meanwhile, I was breaking records in my school's debate team, ranking top in my math competitions, and winning academic awards. If I brought home a trophy, they barely glanced at it before changing the subject to Mia's latest achievement, which, more often than not, was something ridiculous like, most improved in gym class. The breaking point? The night of my school play. I had landed the lead role in our production of Les Miserables. I told my parents weeks in advance, reminded them daily, even left a note on the fridge. The day of the play, I looked into the audience and saw empty seats where they should have been. I found out later they hadn't forgotten. They had just decided to go to Mia's cheerleading practice instead. Not a competition. Not an important event. Just practice. When I confronted them, they told me, "You're independent. You don't need us the way Mia does." That was their excuse for everything. Mia was fragile. Mia needed them more. Mia wasn't as naturally gifted as me, so she required more encouragement. I stopped trying to prove my worth to them. I stopped hoping. But life has a way of forcing you to fight back. And I had no idea that soon, my family was going to make a move so cruel, so unforgivable, that I would have no choice but to show them exactly how independent I could be. I don't know why I kept trying. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation, but a small part of me still wanted their approval. Even after years of being ignored, dismissed, and overshadowed, I convinced myself that if I just accomplished enough, they would have to notice me. They would have to acknowledge that I was worth something, that I was just as important as Mia. I poured myself into school, into every club, every academic competition, every extracurricular that could prove I was someone worth being proud of. While Mia was getting her name called over the school intercom for making the cheerleading squad, which my parents treated like she had won an Olympic gold medal, I was competing at state-level math tournaments, placing first in debate championships, and breaking academic records at my high school. I became the captain of the debate team, the president of the math club, and one of the top students in my entire district. But when I came home excited, holding another first-place trophy, their reactions were always the same: bored disinterest, a half-hearted, "that's nice," followed by an immediate shift to talking about Mia's latest minor accomplishment. When I got a 1560 on my SATs, my mom barely looked up from her phone. When Mia got a 103 on a science quiz, they took her out to dinner to celebrate. The worst part wasn't even the neglect, it was the way they actively made things harder for me. I worked tirelessly for years to build an impressive resume, hoping for a shot at a top-tier university, only to be told that Mia's needs would always come first. And nowhere was this more obvious than the Princeton summer program. It was an opportunity one had been dreaming about since my sophomore year. Princeton only accepted a handful of students from across the country for their prestigious summer research program, and after months of grueling applications, I finally got in. It was a huge deal, one of the biggest academic honors I could have received at my age. I rushed home that day, heart pounding with excitement, hoping, praying that just this once, they would recognize what I had accomplished. I walked into the kitchen, holding the acceptance letter, my voice shaking as I announced, I got into Princeton's summer program. My mother barely looked up from the grocery list she was making. My father didn't even pause from scrolling on his tablet. Mia, sitting at the counter painting her nails, smirked before lazily asking, "Isn't that, like, nerd camp or something?" And then my mother said the words that shattered whatever was left of my hope. "Oh, that's nice, sweetie. But Mia's dance recital is that same week, so I don't think we'll be able to drive you to the airport." I blinked, certain I had misheard her. "What?" "We already told Mia we'd be there for her. You'll have to find another way to get there," she said, as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I stood there, Princeton acceptance letter trembling in my hands, while my sister, who had never once been denied anything, pouted dramatically because I had the audacity to bring up my accomplishment when her recital was so important. For the millionth time, I realized exactly where I stood in this family. They weren't proud of me. They were bothered by me. I ended up taking a 3-hour bus ride and a $40 Uber to get to the airport. I sat alone at the gate, watching other students hug their parents goodbye, listening as they received last-minute advice and words of encouragement. I swallowed the lump in my throat and told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need them. And for a while, I convinced myself that was true. The program at Princeton was everything I had ever wanted. It opened doors, introduced me to like-minded students, and gave me confidence that I had never been allowed to have at home. It was the first time I truly felt like I belonged somewhere. But even then, I made the mistake of calling home. I was on the phone with my mom one evening, trying to tell her about a seminar I attended with a Nobel Prize-winning professor. I barely got 2 sentences out before she interrupted me to excitedly gush about how Mia's cheerleading team had finally won 2nd place at a regional competition. I sat there, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white, listening as she went on and on about Mia's amazing accomplishment. Not once did she ask me about my program, my experiences, or if I was enjoying my time at Princeton. When she finally finished talking about Mia, there was silence. Then she sighed and said, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and your father said you need to call less. We're very busy, you know." I stared at the wall of my dorm room, feeling something inside me snap. I never called them again after that. Not when I was invited to the National Debate Championship. Not when I won a $10,000 scholarship for an essay contest. Not even when I got accepted into one of the top universities in the country. I realized that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, they were never going to see me the way they saw Mia. So I stopped trying. But if they thought I was just going to disappear quietly, they were wrong. Because years later, when my grandfather passed away and left me an inheritance equal to Mia's, my parents finally decided to pay attention to me. And when they tried to take that money away from me, they realized I wasn't the same quiet, obedient daughter they had ignored for years. They had spent my entire life treating me like I was nothing. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. For most of my life, I had been invisible to my family. My achievements were overlooked, my struggles dismissed, and my successes barely acknowledged. But nothing could have prepared me for the day my grandfather's will was read, a day that should have been about mourning and remembrance, but instead turned into a battlefield. My grandfather, my father's father, had been one of the few people in my family who had ever truly seen me. He was a quiet man, reserved but observant, always paying attention in a way my parents never did. When I was younger, he would slip me books on philosophy and history, encouraging my love of learning in a household that cared only for Mia's cheerleading routines. He never said much about the way my parents treated me, but looking back, I realize now that he knew. When he passed away, I expected nothing from his estate. Not because I didn't deserve anything, but because I knew my parents would ensure that Mia was given everything while I was left with whatever scraps they deemed appropriate. I had already resigned myself to it, telling myself that I didn't need their money, that I had built my own path. But my grandfather had other plans. The day of the will reading, the entire family gathered in the office of my grandfather's longtime lawyer, Mr. Calloway, a sharp-eyed man who had known my family for decades. My parents sat stiffly in their chairs. Mia lounged beside them, looking vaguely bored, and I sat off to the side, prepared to endure whatever disappointment was coming my way. Mr. Calloway cleared his throat and began reading the will. The estate was substantial. Years of careful investments had left my grandfather with a fortune that none of us had ever truly understood. He had divided it equally among his grandchildren, ensuring that every single one of us received an inheritance of roughly $650,000. For the first time in my life, I was truly equal to Mia. The second those words left Mr. Calloway's mouth, the temperature in the room shifted. My father's face darkened, my mother's lips pressed into a thin, furious line, and Mia's jaw nearly hit the floor. "Wait," my mother blurted out, cutting off the lawyer mid-sentence. "That can't be right. There must be some kind of mistake." Mr. Calloway barely looked up from the document. "There's no mistake. Your father was very clear about how he wanted his assets distributed." My father let out a strained laugh, as if the whole thing was a ridiculous joke. "Calloway, you knew my father. He wouldn't have wanted this. He always adored Mia." The lawyer sighed, clearly anticipating this reaction. He adored both of his granddaughters, James, and he wanted them to have equal opportunities. A thick silence settled over the room, suffocating and tense. My mother looked at me then, her eyes filled with something I had never seen directed at me before: resentment. "This isn't fair," Mia finally spoke, her voice sharp with disbelief. "You know I need the money more than she does." I turned to look at my sister, who had never in her life needed to fight for anything, who had always expected the world to bend to her will. "How exactly do you figure that?" I asked, my voice calm despite the rage simmering just beneath the surface. Mia let out an incredulous laugh, as if I was the crazy one in this situation. "Because I don't have a real job, okay? I'm working part-time at a yoga studio while trying to figure out my next steps. You're already doing fine. You don't need this money, but I do." I stared at her, wondering if she had ever once in her life realized that I had spent years clawing my way toward independence with no help from anyone. "So, let me get this straight," I said, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Because I worked my ass off, built my career from nothing, and never relied on our parents to hand me everything, I should now just give up what's rightfully mine, just so you don't have to struggle for once in your life?" Mia's face twisted in frustration. "It's not like that. You know how much I've been struggling." "Struggling?" I repeated, laughing bitterly. "Mia, struggling is working 2 jobs just to afford college because your own parents refused to help you. Struggling is taking the bus for years because there was never enough money for a car. Struggling is knowing that no matter how hard you work, you'll never be good enough in their eyes." My father slammed his fist on the table, his face red with fury. "That's enough. Mia needs the money more than you do, and as her family, you should want to help her." I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm even as my hands clenched into fists beneath the table. "Funny," I said, tilting my head. "Because I don't remember anyone ever saying that to Mia when I needed help." Mr. Calloway cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the rising tension in the room. "As I said earlier, the will is final. The inheritance is divided equally. There is no legal avenue to challenge it unless fraud can be proven." My mother turned to me then, her voice suddenly soft, almost pleading. "Sweetheart, please. Think about family. This isn't about what's legal, it's about doing the right thing." I had spent my entire life waiting for my parents to say those words to Mia instead of me. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly as I leveled them with a look that I knew they weren't expecting. "I am thinking about family. For once, I'm thinking about myself instead of the daughter you actually care about." Mia let out an offended gasp, but I ignored her. My father looked like he wanted to yell, my mother looked on the verge of tears, and Mr. Calloway sat in awkward silence, clearly eager to finish the meeting and escape the explosion he had just witnessed. I picked up my copy of the inheritance papers and tucked them into my bag. "This money is mine, whether you like it or not. And if you even try to take it from me, I promise you will regret it. I turned and walked out of that room, feeling, for the first time in my life, the satisfaction of knowing they couldn't ignore me anymore. But I should have known better. Because my father wasn't done fighting. And he was about to do something so much worse than just asking. I should have known my father wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't the type of man to accept losing, especially not to me. After the will reading, I thought they would at least try to guilt-trip me into giving up my share. Maybe they would pull the whole family comes first routine, or my mother would send long-winded texts about how Mia needed me and how I should be the bigger person. I was fully prepared for the emotional manipulation, for the teary voicemails, for the carefully crafted messages about disappointment and selfishness. What I wasn't prepared for was outright theft. I found out a week later, completely by accident. I had been checking my emails at work, sorting through bills and tax documents related to the inheritance, when I noticed something strange. A bank notification, one I hadn't expected, popped up in my inbox, confirming a pending transfer request. The amount? $650,000. My blood ran cold. I hadn't authorized any transfer. I clicked on the email, my heart pounding, and saw the details. The request had been made through the estate's legal accounts, with my father's name listed as the initiator. He had tried to move my inheritance, my money, into another account. I stared at the screen, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. My fingers trembled as I grabbed my phone and immediately called the estate lawyer, Mr. Calloway. The second he picked up, I didn't even let him say hello. Did my father just try to steal my inheritance? There was a heavy pause on the other end, and then a sigh. I was about to call you. I had a feeling you'd see it before I got the chance. I gritted my teeth, trying to keep my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Explain. Now. Mr. Calloway exhaled sharply. Your father attempted to reallocate your share of the inheritance under the claim that it was a clerical error in the distribution. He insisted that your grandfather had meant for the majority of the funds to go to Mia and that you would have been happy to sign it over once the mistake was corrected. I nearly crushed my phone in my grip. And? What did the bank say? The bank flagged the transaction immediately because it was highly irregular, Calloway said. Since your father was acting as executor of the will, he had certain administrative privileges over the estate accounts, but he doesn't have the authority to redistribute funds after probate has been settled. My hands clenched into fists on my desk. So, he actually thought he could just take it? Legally, no, Calloway replied. But I assume he was counting on you not noticing until it was too late. I felt something dark settle in my chest. Reverse the request. Now. It's already been blocked, he assured me. But listen, I need you to come in. There's something else you should know. I left work early that day, walking straight into Calloway's office with fire in my veins. The moment I sat down, he slid a manila folder across the desk toward me. I thought you should see this for yourself. I opened it and felt my stomach drop. Inside were emails, dozens of them, between my father and a different lawyer, one I didn't recognize. The subject lines alone were enough to make my pulse spike. Alternative options for fund reallocation. Potential legal loopholes in inheritance distribution. Challenging terms of equal division. But the worst one was dated just 2 days after the will reading. How to legally disinherit a child after probate. I sucked in a sharp breath. He really tried to. Yes, Calloway confirmed grimly. Your father tried to override the terms of the will after the fact. And when that failed, he moved straight to trying to manipulate the financial system. My stomach twisted with anger. He had already won the battle of favoritism my entire life, had already given everything to Mia while I was left to fend for myself. And now, even when my grandfather had explicitly ensured I would receive my fair share, my father had still tried to take it away. Do I have any legal recourse? I asked, my voice flat and controlled despite the fury burning beneath the surface. Yes, Calloway said, nodding. Since your father attempted to misappropriate estate funds, we can file to have him removed as executor, permanently. I let out a slow exhale, my nails digging into my palms. Do it. Calloway gave a small nod. There's more. I frowned. More? He hesitated. I spoke to your grandmother. My spine straightened at the mention of her. My grandmother, my grandfather's widow, had always been a quiet force in the family, never directly interfering in the favoritism my parents showed Mia, but never encouraging it either. She told me something interesting, Calloway continued. Apparently, years ago, before your grandfather passed, your parents tried to convince him to leave everything to Mia. The room tilted for a second. I stared at him, my hands numb. He refused. Not only did he refuse, but after that conversation, he rewrote his will to include a specific clause, Calloway said. He pulled out another document and pointed to a highlighted section. I leaned forward, reading carefully. Should any party attempt to contest, alter, or otherwise dispute the equal division of inheritance among my grandchildren, that party shall forfeit their right to claim any portion of the estate. My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. So, I said slowly, looking up, because my father tried to manipulate the will, he might actually lose his own inheritance? Calloway gave a grim smile. That's correct. I sat back in my chair, the weight of it all settling over me. My father had spent years making sure Mia had everything, and now, because of his own greed, he had put his own share at risk. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to process it all. Then, slowly, I started to smile. For the first time in my life, my father was about to learn what it felt like to lose. I had spent years believing that my parents' favoritism was something I just had to accept, that no matter how hard I worked, no matter what I achieved, I would always be second to Mia. But as I sat in my lawyer's office, staring at the ironclad clause my grandfather had inserted into his will, I realized something for the first time in my life. This time, I had power, and I wasn't about to waste it. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow-moving storm. My father, completely unaware that his attempted theft had been blocked, was still operating under the delusion that I hadn't noticed. I ignored his smug behavior at family gatherings, his condescending comments about how I should do the right thing for my sister, and my mother's painfully forced small talk, as if buttering me up would convince me to hand over my inheritance. Then, the lawsuit hit them like a wrecking ball. The moment my lawyer filed the petition to have my father removed as executor, the first cracks in his confidence began to show. At first, he tried to play it off like some misunderstanding, calling me one evening with an exaggerated sigh, as if I was some difficult child throwing a tantrum over nothing. You know, sweetheart, if you had just come to me, we could have worked this out privately, he said, his tone dripping with condescension, like I was a naive little girl instead of a woman holding the legal equivalent of a loaded gun. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles ached, forcing myself to remain calm. I did try to handle it privately, I said, my voice dangerously level. But you made it clear that my inheritance was just another thing you thought you could take from me. A sharp silence stretched between us. Then, in a voice colder than I had ever heard before, he said, "You don't understand what you've done." "No, Dad," I said, my anger finally spilling through. "You don't understand what you did. You stole from your own daughter. And now you're going to face the consequences." I hung up before he could respond. The legal proceedings moved faster than I expected. My father, no longer able to manipulate bank transfers behind closed doors, was forced to respond in court. The moment he saw the clause in the will, the one stating that any attempt to challenge the inheritance would result in complete forfeiture of his own share, I watched the blood drain from his face. He had everything to lose now. My mother, ever the peacekeeper, attempted to convince me to drop the lawsuit, calling me in the middle of the night with a voice thick with forced sweetness. "Sweetheart, this is all a big misunderstanding," she cooed, as if I hadn't spent my entire childhood watching her bend over backwards to excuse every terrible thing my father and Mia had ever done. "You know how your father gets. He just wanted what's best for the family. Can't we all just move past this?" I leaned against my kitchen counter, staring at the city lights outside my window, feeling nothing but exhaustion. "You mean move past his attempted theft? Move past the fact that he tried to take away the only thing Grandpa ever gave me? Move past the fact that he and Mia still believe I owe them something, even after everything they've done?" A long pause stretched between us. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You really won't help your sister?" And there it was. The truth buried beneath all the fake concern. This was never about Dad, was it? I asked, my voice eerily calm. This was always about Mia. She hesitated, but I already knew the answer. It had always been about Mia. I hope she was worth it, I said before hanging up. When the court hearing finally arrived, I walked in wearing the kind of confidence my parents had spent my whole life trying to strip from me. My lawyer, Calloway, was already seated at the front, waiting for my father and his legal team to arrive. They were late. I tapped my fingers on the table, watching the door, waiting. And then, 20 minutes past the scheduled time, the courtroom doors swung open. My father walked in looking like a man who had finally realized he was losing. His lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a dark suit, shuffled beside him, flipping through papers as if hoping to find some last-minute miracle. Spoiler, there was none. The judge barely looked up as she addressed my father. "Mr. Daniels, we have received substantial evidence that you attempted to manipulate the distribution of the estate. Given the explicit clauses in the will, I see no reason to delay judgment." My father's lawyer jumped in, attempting to spin some story about miscommunication and administrative errors. The judge wasn't having it. "Your client not only attempted to reallocate funds, but engaged in multiple legal consultations regarding how to contest an already settled will," she said, flipping through documents. "Given these findings, I am ruling to immediately remove Mr. Daniels as executor of the estate and prohibit him from handling any further estate affairs." I stole a glance at my father. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. But then the final blow landed. Furthermore, the judge continued, glancing at the clause Calloway had highlighted, "Due to the explicit forfeiture terms outlined by the deceased, I am ruling that Mr. Daniels' share of the inheritance is revoked." I felt the world tilt for a moment. The courtroom went completely silent. Then, my father exploded. "You can't do that," he shouted, his composure finally cracking as he stood abruptly. "That money is mine." The judge simply raised an unimpressed eyebrow. "No, Mr. Daniels. It was your father's." And he made his wishes very clear. The gavel slammed down, the finality of the ruling sealing my father's fate. His entire inheritance, millions of dollars, was gone. Mia, who had been sitting quietly at the back, gasped out loud, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked at me like she was finally seeing me for the first time. As I gathered my things, Calloway smirked slightly. "Congratulations," he whispered. "You won." But I wasn't celebrating. Not yet. Because even as I left the courtroom, even as I walked past Mia, who now looked terrified about what this meant for her future, I knew that this war wasn't over. My father wouldn't just walk away from this. And I had a feeling he was about to do something desperate. The courtroom ruling should have been the end of it. My father had lost, his inheritance had been stripped away, and for the first time in my life, I had something that was rightfully mine without needing to beg for it. But if there was one thing I should have learned by now, it was that my family didn't know how to let go of something they believed belonged to them. I expected the fallout to be immediate. My father had stormed out of the courthouse that day, his face twisted in rage, his pride shattered in a way that I knew would not be easily repaired. My mother had followed after him, her hands wringing nervously, her lips pressed together so tightly they looked bloodless. But Mia? She had lingered, staring at me with something I couldn't quite place, an expression I had never seen on her before. I thought it was hatred at first. I thought it was the same selfish anger she had always carried, the disbelief that the world wasn't bending to her the way it always had. But there was something else in her eyes that made me pause, something that looked dangerously close to doubt. I didn't have time to figure it out then. The ruling had sent shockwaves through the family, dividing them into two camps, those who believed I had done the right thing by standing up for myself, and those who believed I had ruined the family for money. The phone calls started the next day. Some relatives, distant cousins and aunts I barely knew, reached out in hushed voices, offering quiet support. We always knew your parents favored Mia, one cousin admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But we never thought they'd try something like this. Others weren't so kind. My uncle, my father's younger brother, called me that evening, his voice dripping with disappointment. You should have let it go, he muttered, as if my financial security was something I should have handed over out of family obligation. Your father gave you life, gave you everything, and you repay him like this? I laughed bitterly at that. Everything? I asked, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers ached. Like when they gave me my college fund. Like when they refused to support me through school. Like when they tried to steal what my grandfather left me. He had no response to that. He just let out a heavy sigh and muttered, "Family is supposed to forgive." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. But the one person I didn't hear from was Mia. Not a single text, not a call, not even a passive-aggressive social media post. After the courtroom ruling, she had gone completely silent, disappearing from the narrative in a way that was uncharacteristic of her. Mia was never silent. Mia was never the one to let things go. Which is why I was so surprised when, 2 weeks later, I found her standing outside my apartment building, shifting nervously from foot to foot, clutching her purse like she was afraid I'd slam the door in her face. I probably should have. Instead, I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, staring at my sister like she was a stranger. "What do you want, Mia?" She hesitated, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the strap of her purse. For the first time in our lives, she looked nervous. "Can I come in?" I let out a slow breath, trying to decide if I had the energy for whatever game she was about to play. But something in her expression, something almost lost, made me step aside, letting her slip inside before I could change my mind. She perched on the edge of my couch like she didn't belong there, which was ironic considering how she had always acted like she belonged everywhere. She looked around my apartment, taking in the shelves stacked with books, the framed pictures from my time at Princeton, the awards my parents had never cared about. "You have a nice place," she murmured. I arched an eyebrow. "Yeah, it's amazing what you can afford when your parents don't steal everything from you." She flinched, and for a second, I thought she was going to get defensive, that she was going to launch into a speech about how I was being dramatic or how I had ruined our family's legacy. But instead, she just nodded. "I deserved that," she admitted, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it before. That took me off guard. I blinked, trying to piece together what exactly was happening here. "Mia, why are you here?" She took a deep breath, staring at her hands like she was afraid to meet my gaze. I think I finally understand." I let out a humorless laugh. "Understand what?" "That our parents have been bending over backwards to give you everything at my expense? Or that they finally pushed too hard and lost everything because of it?" Mia looked up then, and for once, she didn't have that entitled, spoiled look that I had grown up despising. She just looked tired. "I didn't realize how much they had set me up to fail," she said softly. "They made sure I never had to struggle, never had to fight for anything, but now I don't even know how to stand on my own." I narrowed my eyes, unsure where this was going. "Mia, you've never had to stand on your own because you've never wanted to." "I know," she whispered. "And that's the problem." Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. She let out a shaky breath. "Dad's furious. He's been meeting with new lawyers, trying to find a way to overturn the ruling, but there's nothing he can do. He's completely cut off from the inheritance now, and he's blaming me for it." I frowned. "You?" She nodded, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "He thinks I should have convinced you to hand over the money. He thinks if I had just played the sympathetic little sister card, you would have caved." I scoffed. "Wow, it's almost like he doesn't know me at all." Mia swallowed hard. "I don't want to be like them," she admitted. "I don't want to be some helpless, entitled brat who expects the world to hand me things. I want to actually do something for myself." I studied her for a long moment, searching for any sign of manipulation, any hint that this was just another attempt to guilt me. But for the first time in my life, Mia actually looked sincere. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked cautiously. She hesitated, then finally said, "Help me. Help me figure out how to actually build something for myself. I don't want to rely on them anymore." I should have told her to leave. I should have slammed the door on her and let her figure it out the way I had been forced to. But instead, I let out a slow breath and said, "Fine. But if you expect me to do the work for you, you can walk right back out that door." Mia smiled, small, hesitant, but genuine. I wouldn't expect anything less. For the first time in our lives, we weren't enemies anymore. Mia's change of heart should have been the hardest thing to believe, but after weeks of watching her actually try, I had to admit something shocking: she was serious. At first, I expected her to give up the moment things got difficult, to come running back with an entitled whine about how I should just fix things for her, the way our parents always had. But instead, she did something I had never seen her do before. She struggled and kept going anyway. She got a real job, not a part-time side gig at a yoga studio, not some favor handed to her by our parents' connections, but an actual entry-level office position where she had to show up every morning like the rest of us. She finally started learning how to manage her own money, asking me questions about budgeting instead of spending every cent the second it hit her account. And the most surprising thing? She applied to college on her own, without our parents' help, without their input, without waiting for someone else to pave the way for her. For the first time in her life, Mia was choosing to stand on her own. Of course, our parents lost their minds when they found out. I should have expected it, but I had no idea just how unhinged they would become until the night we finally confronted them. Mia and I were sitting in my apartment, going over her class schedule, when my phone started buzzing with an all-too-familiar name. I let it ring. I had no interest in another one of his "you betrayed the family" speeches. But then Mia's phone started ringing too, her screen lighting up with a call from Mom. She gave me a wary glance before answering. "Where are you?" My mother's voice came through the speaker, sharp with barely contained anger. "Your father and I are coming over. We need to talk. Now." I raised an eyebrow at Mia, who looked genuinely startled by the urgency in our mother's voice. "Is something wrong?" she asked cautiously. "Just stay where you are," Mom ordered, ignoring the question entirely. "We'll be there in 10 minutes. Mia barely had time to hang up before we heard an angry knock at my front door. I opened it to find my parents standing there, their faces tight with a mix of anger, desperation, and something else I couldn't quite name. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe. "If you're here to convince me to change my mind about the inheritance, you're wasting your time." My father let out a harsh breath, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward. "This isn't about that anymore," he snapped, shoving his hands into his pockets. "This is about your sister's ridiculous choices." Mia straightened beside me, her face hardening. "My choices," she repeated, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it before. "You mean the fact that I finally decided to take control of my own life?" My mother scoffed, her perfectly manicured fingers tightening around the expensive handbag she hadn't even realized she was gripping like a lifeline. "Mia, be serious. You're not cut out for this. You don't have to struggle like your sister. You don't have to prove anything." Mia let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "That's exactly the problem," she shot back. "You made sure I never had to struggle, and now? Now I don't even know how to take care of myself. I had to ask my sister, the one you've ignored our entire lives, how to do the most basic things because you never thought I needed to learn." My father's face twisted in frustration. "We protected you. We made sure you never had to go through what your sister did." I let out a humorless laugh, shaking my head as I stared at them. "And in doing so, you crippled her," I said, watching as they flinched at the accusation. "You spent your whole lives making sure Mia never had to struggle, and now she's terrified of failing because she doesn't know what it's like to actually work for something. Meanwhile, I was never given a choice. I had to fight for everything on my own." My mother's lips parted, as if she wanted to argue, but for once in her life, she had nothing to say. Mia took a slow breath, looking at them with an expression that was heartbreakingly raw. "I love you both," she said, her voice quieter now. But I'm not going to let you keep controlling my life. I need to do this for myself. And if you can't support me, then maybe it's time I step away. For the first time in my life, I saw real panic flash across my parents' faces. My father took a sharp step forward, his voice suddenly desperate. Mia, don't be ridiculous. You need us. No, she interrupted, standing taller. I don't. Silence. Long, heavy, suffocating silence. I had waited years to hear those words come out of her mouth, had spent my entire life believing that Mia would never see what I had always known. But now, standing there, watching my parents finally realize they had lost their grip on both of us, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt done. My mother looked at me then, and for the first time in my life, her expression wasn't filled with annoyance or dismissal. It was filled with regret. You're going to cut us out completely, aren't you? She whispered. I stared at her for a long moment before answering. That depends on you, I said finally. If you ever decide to actually treat me like your daughter instead of an inconvenience, then maybe. But if you're just here to manipulate us into staying under your control, then you've already lost us both. The silence stretched between us, thick with years of unspoken words and missed chances. My father looked like he wanted to fight back, but for the first time, my mother reached for his arm, shaking her head. Let's go, she murmured. And just like that, they left. Mia and I stood there for a long time after they were gone, neither of us speaking. Then, finally, she let out a slow breath and turned to me with a small, genuine smile. That was exhausting. I snorted, shaking my head as I flopped onto the couch. Welcome to my entire life, Mia. She hesitated for only a second before sitting beside me, her posture relaxing for the first time in months. Thanks, she said quietly, nudging me with her shoulder. For everything. I rolled my eyes but smiled. Don't make it weird, Mia. She laughed. For the first time in our lives, we were finally on the same side. And for the first time, I didn't feel alone.